Well, thank you all for coming this evening. I am Columbus City Council Member Shannon Harden, and I'm really excited about this public hearing. It is been over several months that we've been working with Kirwan Institute on the Renewing Our Call to Action report. And so tonight we'll be able to do a bit of a deep dive. Kirwan will be able to talk about what they've seen in the report, and then we'll be able to talk about the city's next steps. So tonight with us we have Mr. Kyle Strickland, Senior Legal Analyst for Kirwan Institute. Mr. Strickland will present on the Kirwan Institute's recent finding around youth vulnerability. We also have Director Carla Williams-Scott from the Department of Neighborhoods. She will give us an overview of the grants process that we'll roll out this evening. After hearing from Director Williams-Scott, we will have time for public comment. If you wish to give public comment, please fill out a speaker slip and turn it into City Council staff. I would like to say that we've had a lot of support from City Council members, from community members. I see so many folks in the audience who have been with us, committed to the work of supporting our young men of color. And I think that that's one of the important pieces that I'll say at the onset of this conversation, and certainly throughout, is that folks have been working to support young men of color for years throughout this community. Organizations have been supporting, churches have been supporting, different government agencies have been supporting. What we're doing tonight, it really is a culminative effort. So many times folks ask, who is MBK? And really the question where we're trying to change that to is, what is my MBK? Because everybody has a role in this work. And so, background on how the city got engaged. In 2014, President Obama launched My Brother's Keeper, challenging cities, nonprofits, and the private sector to close the opportunity gaps between boys and young men of color and the community at large. Columbus was one of the first cities to answer that call. Mayor Michael B. Coleman and I hosted youth summits on all sides of town to hear directly from boys and young men of color. More than 500 men of color, young men came out and expressed their needs for mentors, safe streets, and job training. We took that feedback and released the MBK Youth Perspective Report to outline how our community could collectively move forward. Many Columbus partners, including Franklin County, Columbus City Schools, stepped forward and highlighted existing programs and even created new programs to serve vulnerable young people of color. To highlight Columbus's work, Senator Brown and President Obama's chair of the National MBK Initiative, Broderick Johnson, came to town. After congratulating us on our work, Secretary Johnson told us that without data, we would not truly be able to solve for the issues. So earlier this year, Columbus City Council contracted with Kirwan Institute for the study of race and ethnicity to gather data on youth vulnerability and to establish an asset map of programs serving young boys and men of color and outline a strategic investment framework. We spent the past 2 months holding stakeholder conversations around health, safety, education, and economics. Those stakeholders, typically nonprofits or institutional partners, help to create the themes that we'll use to evaluate the grant program that Director Carla Williams-Scott will discuss later. So without further speaking, I'll turn it over to Mr. Kyle Strickland for Kirwan Institute to talk about Renewing Our Call to Action report. Thank you, Kyle.
Excellent. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Councilmember Harden, Director Carla Williams-Scott, the rest of Department of Neighborhoods, and Columbus City Council for your leadership on this effort. I want to start with the Kirwan Institute's report of our call to action. As the Councilmember discussed, this particular report will focus on ways in which we can actually set goals and measure our progress as we move forward. And so as we highlight this report, which focuses on 4 main themes: education, economic, health, and safety. These are 4 critical issues to life outcomes for boys and young men of color, as well as any other vulnerable youth. So first, the Renewing Our Call to Action report focuses on a whole host of our history that must be looked at. So if you see here is a racial distribution map of the city of Columbus. So as you can see, there's a clear divide between the east and the west sides of the city. This is broken down by predominant census tract by race. So predominantly on the west side of the city of Columbus, ages 0 to 24, you see predominant white population. On the east side, you see predominantly African-American black population on the east side. And why is this important? Well, one, it's important to recognize that given these differences, there are sure to be differences in terms of the life outcomes and the experiences with youth growing up in different neighborhoods. And you have to understand the cumulative barriers that it takes growing up in these neighborhoods. We also have to understand that this did not happen overnight, and this is actually a pattern that exists all throughout urban cities and all across the nation. And it's the result of residential and racial segregation and discrimination and policies that existed in the past and that were put in place intentionally that have led to this sort of residential segregation. Now, Columbus, of course, is not immune to this challenge. While we have experienced decades of social and economic growth, we also understand that some of our residents and many of our youth are left behind today, which is why looking at our history is important, but we also have to figure out where do we move from here. Well, one, we have to understand that growing up in these different neighborhoods and different experiences, you might experience different things, such as lack of access to opportunity and resource and outcomes. And so it's up to us to figure out what are these stresses that youth are experiencing. So the Kirwan Institute developed a definition of vulnerability around a couple of key themes. So we define vulnerability as the cumulative product of encountering environmental and interpersonal stressors. So environmentally, these stressors that heighten vulnerability can be structural, institutional, and interpersonal in nature. Interpersonally, economically, or socially, or racially motivated triggers that are grounded in explicit or implicit bias can also induce stress and heighten vulnerability. And it's important that we talk about vulnerability not as an individual's own source of stress, but rather the neighborhoods and conditions that they're growing up in. Vulnerability is not the product of any one person or any one set of a community, but rather all of the institutional and structural pieces that play a role. And they lead to toxic stressors that can take a toll on an individual's life outcomes. And this especially is true for youth, as well as our youth of color, because those that are experiencing heightened areas of vulnerability mean that they have more stress on their plates, which is why as service providers, as stakeholders in our community, we must focus on providing a trauma-informed approach to understand where these toxic stressors are coming from. So in order to develop and determine what vulnerability is in terms of what this means holistically, we actually calculated 4 main domains. These domains are education, economic, health, and safety. And what we decided to do was actually utilize indicators on the basis of ACS census tract data to actually measure specific indicators in a particular domain. So for example, under education, we chose 6 indicators that represent life outcomes in terms of education. That's 3rd grade reading proficiency, high school graduation rate, student mobility rate, student attendance rate, teacher attendance rate, and young adult educational attainment. Now, these indicators alone are not an exhaustive list of what makes up education vulnerability or opportunity in that particular domain. However, these are key indicators that play a role and is something that we need to focus on as far as when we focus on looking at education and looking at these indicators. Under economic, we chose 4 main indicators: the poverty rate, the housing cost burden, median household income, and the unemployment rate. Housing cost burden means that a particular family is spending 30% or more on their income or of their income on their rent. And that is especially a burden in terms of folks facing these stressors. Under health, we have health insurance percentage, modified retail food equity index, which is the percentage of how close you are to healthy food and retail. So this is especially an issue when we talk about food insecurity and is a critical aspect of health. And then as well as life expectancy at birth. Now, life expectancy at birth is a holistic measure that covers a whole host of issues and also can indicate the quality of a particular life outcome and lifespan. And now under safety, we have prison incarceration rate, violent crime rate, and gun violence rate. Again, All of these indicators are not an exhaustive list of what goes in a particular domain. However, they point to key areas in which we can determine how many toxic stressors are happening. So how do we measure this? You know, we have these indicators, but what does this look like when it comes down to measurement? Well, first, at the Kirwan Institute, our focus is based on our decades of research on opportunity mapping, which actually looks at how opportunity is bundled throughout a community. But for this particular report, we're focused on vulnerability. And so we look at to see how vulnerability is bundled throughout an entire community, and here, the city of Columbus. So for example, if a third grade reading proficiency in a particular census tract or neighborhood is low, then that will indicate a high vulnerability area, and then as well as economic health and safety. So what we've done is actually broken down it into 5 domains by neighborhood level. So you'll have very low vulnerability to very high vulnerability. And this will actually see the distribution of what vulnerability looks like through the city of Columbus. And we'll show you here at this next map. So as you can see here on your maps and on your presentations here, vulnerability is distributed all throughout the city of Columbus. And as you see with the red and very high vulnerability, the light red is high vulnerability, moderate vulnerabilities in yellow, low vulnerability is in light blue, and then very low vulnerability is in dark blue. So the grayed out areas are cities that are not City of Columbus, but as you can see, the maps of the City of Columbus, you can see that there are very high areas of vulnerability around the surrounding areas of the Near East Side, parts of Linden, Hilltop on the west side, as well as the south side. And you can see that vulnerability is actually concentrated in these areas. And so you can understand that children and youth and community members that are growing up in these neighborhoods are experiencing heightened access to vulnerability. But again, this is just made up of 16 indicators. Right here in this particular map doesn't have any data around demographic information. It's solely information based on those 16 indicators of economic, health, education, and safety. And you can see that folks are experiencing high areas of vulnerability. But even in those areas that are in light blue or in dark blue, individuals still experience vulnerability, but it's just not as high relatively compared to some of the areas closer by in dark red. And so why is this important? Well, one, as we showed you from the beginning, while some of these high vulnerability neighborhoods match up with some of our priority neighborhoods all throughout the city and the neighborhoods that we're focused on, we also want to highlight, well, where are youth growing up and where are they coming from these neighborhoods? If you remember from the beginning of the racial distribution map, you can see that predominantly on the east side of the city where there are high levels of vulnerability matches up with the east side in terms of the racial distribution map where there are higher rates of youth of color growing up in that particular area. So we're actually going to move on to the next slide, which shows a side-by-side comparison by youth vulnerability and racial distribution. So as you can see, youth of color are disproportionately experiencing levels of high or very high vulnerability. And that's why it highlights the need for a program like My Brother's Keeper, an investment in boys and young men of color, as well as other vulnerable youth in order to lift up all of our youth. But it's also important when we see this map to understand that this is not the fault of any individual or any one community, but rather the structural pieces that were put in place over time, the policies that were put in place. And so as a result, this is something that is a result of disinvestment, historic issues. But here in the city of Columbus, we have a responsibility to combat this type of vulnerability and segregation. And this is something that we must do in order to lift up our youth. So a key look at some of the key facts here, as again I mentioned that youth of color disproportionately live in areas of high or very high vulnerability. Here's a couple of breakdowns. Vulnerability and youth demographics. Youth of color are 18% more likely than white youth to live in a neighborhood experiencing high or very high vulnerability. That's compared to white youth who are 62% more likely to live in an area of low or very low vulnerability. And 1 in 10 white early childhood, so ages 0 to 4, in K through 12 youth, ages 5 to 17, live in neighborhoods with very high vulnerability. So those neighborhoods in dark red, as I mentioned before. Now that's compared to 1 in 5 early childhood and K through 12 youth of color living in neighborhoods with very high vulnerability. So in order to address these disparities, we focus on a couple of main themes, which is raising the bar and closing the gap. So how, as Councilmember Harden mentioned, can we use data to actually set goals and measure success? Well, first, we can look at raising the bar. So by comparing how youth in Columbus fare on selected indicators to the national, state, and county averages, we actually can work as a community to make sure we're lifting or we're raising the bar to make sure that all youth are succeeding. And then also, it's incredibly important here in Columbus and across the nation, we must close the gap. And so that means tracking the disparities between youth living in low and high vulnerability neighborhoods, and we actually should focus on disaggregated data by race and gender so that we can look at how we can strategically work to eliminate disparities and close achievement gaps. So for tonight's purposes, we've discussed both the raising the bar and closing the gap portion in further detail in the report. But for tonight, we're going to focus just on one theme, which is closing the gap, and that's in these specific neighborhoods. So first, under education, we have closing the gap. So as you can see, we actually have a breakdown of the indicators and how they respond in particular neighborhoods. For example, the differences are stark. So if you look at third grade reading proficiency, the average of those neighborhoods that were in dark red that we showed before, you have a 21% third grade reading proficiency rate, well below the average that is necessary in terms of where we want to be. But compare that to very low vulnerability neighborhoods, those blue, light blue neighborhoods that you saw, you actually have a 68% third grade reading proficiency, which again, still isn't necessarily where we'd want to be when we compare to a higher average. However, you can see the differences. There's a 47% difference of the third grade reading proficiency rate in neighborhoods of high and very high vulnerability versus those in very low vulnerability neighborhoods. You can see the same when it comes to student mobility rate. 23% of those living in neighborhoods of very high vulnerability experiences that rate of student mobility. Compare that to 8%, which is very low. And as we know, or we don't know, if we don't know, the research shows that student mobility affects a student's life outcomes and chances greatly, and it affects the school's ability to keep track of kids that are coming in and out of the classroom but are having to move around. And so there are all sorts of factors. And that's also what we want to highlight, and that we don't want anyone to get caught up on any one single indicator, but that's one of the things that we want to highlight as well, is the fact that each of these domains under education, economic, health, and safety, they're all interrelated. So for example, if you're experiencing lower rates of high school graduation and young adult educational attainment, you're likely to also be experiencing higher rates of poverty or unemployment in your particular community. But this is important because it understands that we can see that within the city of Columbus alone, mere neighborhoods that are minutes apart experiencing these vastly different rates. And so we have to understand to look beyond just the numbers and realize what this means for real people and real lives in our youth in Columbus. So next, we're going to look at economic, closing the gap in economic. What can we do in the city of Columbus to close the gap economically? So we have some very stark numbers here. So in very high vulnerability neighborhoods, you are seeing individuals experiencing an average for poverty rate of 60%. Compare that with those in very low vulnerability neighborhoods at 8%. That's a nearly 52% difference in the poverty rate of neighborhoods that could be mere minutes apart. And this is something, again, that we highlight the need for this investment and for us to be able to use data to focus on these specific areas. So for example, if you're a stakeholder in the economic domain and that's your focus, then we can actually look at how can we target issues of poverty, how can we target issues of unemployment to get at some of these numbers and some of these issues. We can look at those experiencing housing cost burden. That's 29% compared to those at 9% in very low vulnerability neighborhoods. Again, highlighting the need for those to be connected with programs and opportunities so folks are not experiencing these housing cost burden. Again, it also highlights the need for issues of wage and making sure that folks are having the wage and a living wage so they can actually afford to be able to afford their rent without being burdened. Then you can see the median household income is drastically different. You got $23,850 as average median household income in a neighborhood of very high vulnerability versus $80,000. So nearly $60,000 difference in a neighborhood of very low vulnerability. These are neighborhoods that are right next to one another, and yet we see these stark differences, which highlights that we can and must do more to close the gap and eliminate some of these disparities. The unemployment rate, these are 2015 numbers from the ACS census data here, but it was at the time 19%, very high in the very high vulnerability neighborhoods compared to 4% in very low vulnerability neighborhoods. Next, you have health, closing the gap in healthcare. You have percentage of youth with health insurance, it's 86%, very high vulnerability compared to 95% and very low vulnerability. So just that it might not seem large, but that 9% difference means a lot. And that means access to care, access to preventative services, and without that access, it correlates with larger problems that can affect other outcomes of health and safety. Again, as we look at the percentage of healthy food retailers, the Modified Retail Food Environment Index, you can see very high vulnerability neighborhoods at 14% compared to those in very low vulnerability neighborhoods at 35%. So there's much greater access to opportunity and to healthy food in these neighborhoods. But this is a number that I want to highlight is the life expectancy. Very high vulnerability neighborhoods, 72 years old is the average life expectancy of those living in the very high vulnerability neighborhoods. Compare that to those in very low vulnerability neighborhoods, which is 80. That is an 8-year difference in the life expectancy of an individual born in a particular neighborhood, and it shows and highlights that place matters in terms of your life outcomes in the city of Columbus as well as throughout the country. And we understand that in order to provide quality access to care and life outcomes, we have to focus on addressing these disparities, and we know we can do it because there are some of our neighborhoods that are doing very well while others are not. So we have to focus on issues such as life expectancies, and that, of course, is affected by a whole variety of factors. Another issue we want to talk about, which is a big issue, is safety. How do we close the gap in safety? And you can actually see the stark differences in the three indicators here that we have. Jail incarceration rate here, 9.3 incidents per 1,000 compared to 0.6 in very low vulnerability neighborhoods. We want to highlight this number specifically here, that just because the incarceration rate in a particular neighborhood is higher does not mean that individuals are committing crimes at a higher rate. So I just want to highlight that it is an important caveat to highlight that there are other aspects that go into why these rates are much higher in other neighborhoods, and so it's important to also focus on other issues. Our other research also shows that the higher incarceration rates also correlate with areas in which there are schools and opportunities where there are higher incidences of zero tolerance policies. So this is a problem all throughout the nation, and the need to address some of these disparities at the younger age so that we are having less and less instances of incarceration rate. But I wanted to highlight that so that folks understand the structural pieces that come into it and not an individual level issue necessarily. Violent crime rate, you see, and this is an issue that we're facing here that we see every day nearly, is 16.1 incidences violent crime per 1,000 compared to 1.7 in very low vulnerability neighborhoods. Gun crime rate, 5.6 instances per 1,000 compared to 0.3. That's a 15-point difference when you actually break that down to calculations. And again, as we discussed earlier, we have to look beyond just the numbers. This data helps orient us and helps us look at some of the indicators that we can utilize. And again, this is something that we don't want to get caught up in any one indicator, but we have to understand clearly that the disparities that exist between high and very low vulnerability neighborhoods are great, and this affects the life outcomes of our youth. And that's something that we need to address. And again, you can actually, when the report is released later this evening, you'll actually be able to do a deeper dive into the numbers, and you can actually utilize our online interactive story map in which you can actually deep dive into the data and see how these neighborhoods are spread, or how these numbers are spread out throughout the neighborhoods. But we must combat these issues. So that's why we're all here, and that's why we've been doing this work for as long as we've been doing it, and especially those who've been doing the work even before the My Brother's Keeper initiative launched in the first place, and your efforts should be lauded as well. We have significant community assets in the domains of education, economic, health, and safety that can be leveraged to address disparities and improve outcomes for vulnerable youth. And in the report, you'll see in further detail, we'll break down issues in education, so services such as after-school services, mentoring services. When it comes to issues of economic domain, we have those that focus on workforce development and other sorts of issues around that. Health, focus on those with trauma-informed approaches, trauma intervention services, and then, of course, under safety, anti-recidivism programs and violence prevention programs. So we have a lot of programs all throughout the city of Columbus that are addressing some of these issues and some of these disparities. But the question is, what are we doing to leverage these programs? And that's kind of where all of us come in to play to target and address some of these disparities that exist. And so as we kind of close this portion of the report, here's how we can move forward. So first, you should download the full report online at the Kirwan Institute's website. You can actually check out the entire report in its entirety. And you can view the online interactive story map for a deeper dive into the data. And that will kind of highlight the numbers that we mentioned today. But again, this work and these issues did not happen overnight, so they will not be solved overnight. But it is something in which all of us have a stake in it, whether you're local government or nonprofit or church organization or an individual who's running programs in your basement or wherever you're trying to help folks and help our youth of color and youth succeed. We need you involved in this effort. It will be a long process, but we have to show our commitment to our boys and young men of color and other vulnerable youth as well. And that's why this report is focused on renewing our call to action. Now, we were first called to act, but we have to continue to renew that call to show that we are invested. And of course, all of you who are here today are invested in this effort, and we want to make sure that you can continue to be invested. And Director Carla Williams-Scott I will turn it over to her, and she will highlight the MBK Grants Program and how we all can move forward in our next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Councilmember Harden, and thank you to our community members that are here this evening. I'm excited to share with you this grants opportunity to support organizations that are working on MBK initiatives and programs. And I first want to start out by saying this is a new opportunity. So we will be working out some kinks as we go through. So I just want to, share that as well. These grants will allow our service providers the opportunity to develop innovative initiatives and programs to support boys and young men of color. They will allow us to reach our most vulnerable population, as Kyle pointed out in the highlighted information in the Kirwan report. As revealed in the report, we are keenly aware that we must address the vulnerability that our young men face, with special focus on economics, education, health, and safety. The grant program will be facilitated through an RFP process, which will be administered by my team in the Department of Neighborhoods. It is our plan to make a formal announcement of the RFP process in late January 2018, following the passage of the 2018 budget. Following the announcement, we will have an RFP information session in mid-February of 2018. This information session will allow organizations interested in applying the opportunity to learn more about the RFP process. All organizations interested in applying will be asked to submit a letter of intent in late February with a grant application available in mid to late March. The application timeline will also include an open question and answer period to further assist applicants as they complete the RFP. The grants will be centered around the 4 vulnerability indexes of economics, education, health, and safety that are identified in the Kirwan report. Applicants will be encouraged to submit applications that are collaborative in nature around 1 or more of the 4 vulnerability indexes mentioned. At this time, the grant process will be for the 2018 budget year only, but could be considered in future years providing the availability of funding. It is our hope that organizations will use the city funding to leverage funding through other grant opportunities. Following today's hearing, the MBK report, as Kyle mentioned, will be on the Kirwan website, but it will also be posted on the MBK Village website at www.mbkvillage.org. Also, when it is available next year, you will find the RFP announcement and timeline on the mbkvillage.org website. This will allow everyone the opportunity to follow the process that we are using for funding. Additionally, we will alert potential applicants and the general public about the RFP information sessions that will be held in February. Attendance at this session will be mandatory for all applicants who desire to participate in the RFP process. These announcements will be done via the MBK website, the Department of Neighborhoods website. Applicants and interested parties may call our office at 614-645-1993, and I'll repeat that again, 614-645-1993 for additional grant information. And we also ask you to please continue to check the mbkvillage.org website, as that's where we'll be providing updates about the process.
Thank you, Director, and really just to highlight your office and Mayor Ginther's support and commitment to this effort. As part of the original Youth Perspective Report, it was recommended that we have a point person within the administration to work on MBK Village, and that person is housed within your department. I know we are working to fill that position. We had a person who moved on to a different position, but we're working right now to fill that position. But thank you for your commitment. Look forward to working with you and your department. Thank you, Kyle, again for the data. So, you know, when we got the call, so again, remind folks that it was 2015 when we wrote out the Youth Perspective Report. We were very, very excited about it. We have copies of it. It is a beautiful document. I was always most concerned that it would be a document that sat on the shelf and did not turn into anything. That still is my concern with this work. When we're talking about a vulnerable population, it's a population that has been let down time and time again. And so I know how important it is for this work to actually yield results. And so I remember coming off the stage with Broderick Johnson, and he did all the good stuff that a good politician will do in front of people, which is say that this was good and highlight what we had done well. But he really did criticize the fact that we didn't have the data behind the report. And so I know this was a long drawn out. I know that data is not exciting. I know it doesn't get us all, you know, real fired up, but data is critical to us moving forward. If you don't measure what you're talking about, you don't mean it. And so we mean this work. And so that is why we have taken the time to work with Kirwan. That is, you know, we want this information, this data to be actionable. So Director talked about the dollars that we'll put on the street in 2018. It is a drop in the bucket, and it is not the city's full commitment to young men of color. It is a piece of the pie. It is to encourage collaboration amongst churches, community groups, individuals who are doing the work already. It is not the entire component, and it should not be seen as such. we see this work as an ongoing effort, an ongoing commitment, and we will, more than anything, want folks to use the dollars in terms of leveraging other dollars. One of the things that we as a city need to, or we're going to, community have to figure out is how do we go after state and federal dollars and nonprofit dollars as well. And so it is my hope, and Kyle, maybe you can speak to this, how can folks access this data to use in their own grant applications for other grants, state, federal, national grants that are possibly out there?
Certainly. So that's a great question. So again, you can actually visit the online, so you read the entirety of the report, but you can also visit the online story map, what actually provides a pretty deep dive into the data. And I think it's also important if, for example, let's say you're an organization in a particular neighborhood, and let's say you're in one of these high vulnerability neighborhoods. You can actually utilize the data and the map to actually click on your particular neighborhood. You can see the numbers. One, you can see the breakdown of how many youth are in your neighborhood from ages 0 to 24. How many of those are youth of color? And you can actually see the breakdown by race. You can see the breakdown by sex. And then under there, you can also see a breakdown of where folks are on a particular set of indicators, where they're doing in terms of economic, health, safety, and other sorts of issues that are highlighted. And what's important about that is because if I'm an organization that's in a particular neighborhood, I want to know what's the situation like with youth in my area. So I know what it's like qualitatively. I know those stories. I hear their stories. I see them every day. But what is it like when the numbers are actually put behind that? And that's why it's so critical with the national initiative, the My Brother's Keeper National Initiative, which is kind of turning into a kind of nonprofit status and will be a part of the former President Obama's later Obama Foundation as far as those federal dollars when they move forward. It's important for us to actually utilize that data. And so a lot of cities, a lot of places all throughout the country have actually used data to set goals and measure success. And that's something that I would encourage applicants to utilize. That, for example, they could say, we're going to work with 4 organizations in a particular area, and we want to tackle the high school graduation rate. Now, we know that them alone, these organizations alone can't do it on their own. However, they can keep track of whether they're improving or not improving in these areas. And we also know that there are other organizations around this city that are tracking their progress. And that's another thing that I would like to highlight is the need for more organizations to be utilizing uniformed measures so that we can keep track on key issues. And so when we look at these 4 domains, we don't want anyone to get caught up on any single indicator, but we should focus on education. How can we get folks in the education realm working together consistently? Because we know that we can do something on one-off approaches and programs, but how do we do this on a consistent basis? And also, we have to look at how can we utilize existing dollars and leverage those in a way to target programs and issues more effectively? That's something that all of us can look at, the city as well as us as individuals at the state and federal levels.
As part of the report, there is an asset map. Can you talk about that, like, and why we did that and what it is?
Of course. So part of the report, which was not included in today's presentation, but is online, is on the online form, is actually an asset map which highlights a brief snapshot. So we just took a look at 300 programs that affect youth and that provide youth services and provide a breakdown. And what we found is when we mapped this out throughout the city of Columbus, that there's a lot of programs, and this is only 300 of them, and we know there are far more. But the problem is that there might be a lot of programs, but there still are these persistent, deep structural issues that exist. So that we know that oftentimes these service providers are serving kind of on the front lines and are stemming the tide of vulnerability and are dealing with these stressors every single day. And that's important and that's necessary. But we also know that abundance alone is not going to solve the problems. You can actually utilize and see that there are gaps in services. So there's a high concentration near East Side and downtown in terms of services that are provided that affect youth. However, we see that under these areas that there's high sources of vulnerability and stress. So how can we be more strategic about whether if I'm starting a new program or organization, where I'm going to be placed or which youth I'm going to be served, which neighborhoods I'm going to be served. So you can actually look at the asset map, which provides a holistic look at all of the services that are around. So there's about 300 of them, and we know there are far more. But again, these services alone just highlight that there are physical gaps, but there are also structural gaps that exist. There's also in their full report, there's information regarding youth service providers and a survey by them basically discussing these issues of we've got a lot of service providers, but there's not a consistent set of collaboration and communication.
And my last question before we go to public speakers. There has been, and always is a conversation about should you be focusing specifically on young men of color? One, what about young girls of color? What about vulnerable youth in particular? Is there in this data, how can this data be used to talk about vulnerable youth in general, and then specifically young boys of color?
Of course. So that was one of the key issues that we looked at when we started this report. We had a lot of conversations about just that. Well, one, first we must highlight the fact that girls and young women of color are growing up in the very same neighborhoods and going to the very same schools and are in the same households of boys and young men of color. However, with the focus in terms of My Brother's Keeper has to do with the fact that specifically black and brown youth and youth of boys and young men of color on nearly every single major indicator are lagging behind in outcomes. And this is something that we also see lagging behind with girls and young women of color, which is the important focus on youth of color. So we actually, what we've done in this report, we've actually divided it up in segments. So we look at boys and young men of color. We also look at youth of color, which includes girls and young women of color. And then we look at all youth, which includes white youth and other youth as well. And it's important to make that distinction because we know that, and that's why we focus on closing disparities and by closing the gap and raising the bar. So if we address those who are experiencing the highest levels of vulnerability, which again are disproportionately youth of color, then we can lift up communities in which all youth are vulnerable and are a part of.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you again for the work that you've done over the several months, and your team actually from Kirwan.
Yeah, of course. And I just want to give a quick shout out to the entire team that was a part of this report. So Joshua Bates, our social policy analyst, Brianna Stack, our research assistant, Zach Knitzer, our postdoctoral research associate, Ashley Wilson, program manager, Mick Young-Bake, a senior researcher, Jillian Ollinger, a senior researcher as well, Mary McKay, who's a graduate research associate, Kelly Capitosto, senior researcher, Matt Martin, senior researcher, and Jason Duffield, our graphic designer. And again, this work would have not began without the efforts of our former director, Sharon Davies, who just spearheaded this effort and wanted Kirwan to really address this issue, as well as the rest of our senior leadership, Christy Rogers and Jason Reese, as well as now our current interim director, Dr. Art James, and all those at Kirwan who helped contribute to this. So I just wanted to give a moment to thank them who made this all possible, and of course all of you. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Now we'll move into the public speaker portion of this public hearing. Just to remind folks, since this is a public hearing, we ask that you state your name, any organization that you represent, and for the purpose of timing, stick to about 3 minutes. We have about 5 folks right now. I encourage folks, if you still, we certainly still have time to sign up to speak if you'd like. I would like as much feedback and engagement as possible as we continue on this work. And so with that, I would like to call up Ms. Kay Wilson. Sorry about that. Okay, how are you this evening? Welcome to Council. Thank you for coming to the public hearing.
Thank you. So thank you, Councilmember Hardin, Director Carla Williams Scott, and to the Kirwan Institute. Just wanted to ask the question, from 2014, I know specifically there was an article in the Dispatch in 2015 in regards to participants who receive federal funding for MBK. I'm thinking of community development for all people, as that is what the article was written of. And wanted to know, one, the data is great, and we do know in order for progress, we do need to have data. The one thing that I think sometimes we get away from is the common denominator. So you can have data, you can have outcomes, but if you're looking at, not looking at organization specific, sometimes that data is skewed. And so I'm wondering, do we have data about previously funded organizations, and not so much the organization, but best practices that they might have used, things that worked and things that might not have worked or might not have gotten the outcomes that we would have hoped to, so we can grow from that? As well as in regards to areas. So when we look at the downtown and the Near East area is having quite a bit of organizations that do work with young people for the programs, there's an issue of transportation for our young people to get there. So do we also look at the possibility of spreading out our services? So the first question in regards to previous things, so we can learn from best practices, and then looking at how can we find the best common denominator for organizations when looking at how to, I guess, put out this money within the community?
Certainly. Let me take a stab at both of those. First, as it pertains to previous funding, a lot of the funding that we have, that the city gives out for that touches young men of color usually goes through our human service funding, and it's rarely so specific that it's for young men of color. But we know that if it's going to the Urban League, if it's going to the several highly competent community organizations, that it is essentially touching young men of color. One of the reasons why we wanted to do a specific breakout and get data specific to and metrics specific to young men of color, I think is to your point, because we want to be able to challenge, to raise the bar and close the gap, as Kirwan would say, but in the way I see it, challenge folks and then hold folks accountable for the work that they're doing with young people of color. And I think that is a funding conversation that can't be done wholly just with City Council because, or with the city, because our portion of that funding is just one component. My vision, and I think the vision of a lot of folks, is to how do we bring those dollars together and talk in a collaborative way to encourage funding. So that's kind of the answer to the previous data. What I hope this does is provide baseline data that all organizations can use to pull upon, and we'll still need to do the work of holding all folks accountable on a set standard. To the where the place question, you know, where the issues are versus where the programming is. I hope that we begin to have that more specific conversation through the asset map that we have. When you go online, you'll literally be able to see, and we only have 300 organizations. We know that there are probably another 300, you know, smaller churches and such that are doing things in neighborhoods that we didn't catch. But you'll be able to see specifically where organizations are, what services they provide, and see if there is a gap. And sometimes some organizations might argue that there doesn't need to be the physical proximity to the youth or to the community to provide that service, and that might be for cost purposes. But we will be able to specifically see and identify. Would Director or Kyle have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Councilmember. So there, in the asset map, it shows the physical location of a particular service provider, but it doesn't necessarily show the service range. So you could be, you know, located, for example, on downtown, but serve Near East Side neighborhoods or serve South Side neighborhoods. But what is important from that to highlight is, even if that's the case, your physical location is further away from your physical population that you're serving. As you mentioned, transportation is often a barrier, and that actually came up in the full report, it is a barrier to reaching boys and young men of color and other vulnerable youth. And that's a question that goes beyond just organizations and how we can address those issues. That's another deeper question at the local, state level when we talk about issues of transportation. So you can actually see physical location, but even then, when we talk about service areas, you have to ask about if we're providing these services, how are those services being utilized? Are those being utilized efficiently? Are individuals feeling comfortable when they utilize those services? And that requires a deeper set of conversations, which I think might be getting at some of your points, which is, how can we convene consistently organizations and stakeholders around these issues, not just to have more talk necessarily, but to really talk deeply about best practices. And I think the way we can actually put our money where our action is with this MBK grants program, which says we pledge to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to work and utilize best practices along the way. And then we can actually challenge folks and hold them accountable to see whether they met those goals or at least strived to reach them.
Thank you.
Next, we have Coach Satch Sullinger. Coach, welcome back to council, and thank you for your continued engagement lifting up young men of color.
I'm Satch Sullinger. I'm the chair of the board for trying to develop a prep school for boys of color called Master Prep Academy. My concerns are mainly with the education, because we all know without the educational aspect, nothing changes. And so we can complain, that means we know what the problem is. And so all we're really doing is describing water as we drown. We need to do something about it. My 7 points that I want to bring out is the system in Columbus City schools and the public schools across this country are failing our kids. Example, we have kids that have failed third grade math all the way up to the 9th grade, and they still get promoted. But then teachers are being held accountable for kids passing the 10th grade proficiency. And it's impossible because the kids have been conditioned to think that, well, it'll take care of itself, it'll take care of itself. By the time reality hits them, now they've become a problem to our society. And so, we have to look at our system. We also have to understand that one size doesn't fit all. Just because I do it at one school doesn't mean that we have to do it at all the schools. We need to meet the needs of the kids at the school that we are serving. Next, our administrators need to include their staff. Staff is where the rubber meets the road. Instead of dictating to the staff, administrators need to listen to their staff. Inclusion. The teachers know what's going on in them halls much better than the administration does. Next, I would say that the kids that are constantly disrupting class need to be separated, not as a penalty, but put in the class together to develop leadership, because out of that, somebody's going to become a leader, and that the teacher can teach at their level. But when we keep them involved in the same class, they decide how little everyone else learns. And that's not fair. And the last point that I would like to bring out is, policies by administrators in August need to be tweaked periodically during the year, because what works in August is not necessarily going to work all year long. And my example of that is, in August, you have a student body that wants to pass. Midway through the year, you have kids that there's nothing they can do to pass. And then you have kids that there's nothing they can do to fail, who education is not important to them. And then you have the kids that are wanting to learn. And then come April and May is when the parents decide, I'm taking my kid out of here, we're going to move somewhere else. Instead of taking the kids and putting them in a class together where that they can learn. Until we meet the educational needs of our communities and our kids, nothing's going to change. And along with that, there has to be an umbrella that brings in the mental health issues that our kids are dealing with, and in different communities, and like the South End, for an example, is totally different than what's going on in the North End. You know, there's no businesses there. You know, we need entrepreneur classes in those buildings to meet the needs, to have these kids develop their own jobs. But that's where I come in at, the educational part. And I just wanted to add that to my brother's keeper, because we can't continue doing the same thing.
Thank you, Coach. I think one thing that this conversation will call for is accountability, and for us to sometimes get into uncomfortable spaces with our friends and folks who have been doing good work. But at this point, we all need to step up. Right. So, thank you, Coach.
Thank you.
Next, we have D. Asher. Is that correct? I apologize. How you doing this evening?
Yeah, how you doing? My name is D. Ashley. I'm just a concerned citizen.
Sure.
First, I suggest to everybody, especially minorities, if you get a chance to read this book, Chokehold by Paul Butler. I'd like to address some points real quick. First, I'd like to start out by saying stagnant solutions and talks. $137 million for new jails. Over $2 million is going to be allocated to new programs and more officers. Just what our youth needs right now. Let's peel back the blinders, folks. I salute this program and all its intentions, but I pose a question to all that hear me. When will the citizens, especially of inner urban communities riddled with youth crime, when will we be fed up enough to act? When will our politicians stomp their feet and initiate policies and act in policies that are needed to reform, beginning with the judicial systems? Not just to be a judicial system of machine for profit, but more for fair individual judgment on individual basis. I ask the politicians to demand an emergency request for working body cameras to be for these officers that are in the community to protect our citizens, so they can protect us better and protect themselves as well. How can we lead by example if law officials and authorities are not held accountable to laws rather than regulations, camera department regulations? What kind of example are we showing our youth? Especially our officers in our communities. Can we start teaching them to diffuse situations rather than to instigate? Can we teach them not to profile based off leads? Can we teach them not to shoot in fear, instead maybe shoot in self-defense with a weapon present? I'm tired of the life lost. I'm tired of the angry youth turning on each other. It starts with high up the ladder. Accountability, yeah, we know it. We've been talking about it for a long time. Are y'all mad yet? Are y'all sad yet? Are y'all tired of crying? More than making it mandatory, let's start policing everybody that's in these positions. Let's start making it a law for these cameras so everybody can feel safe in our communities. You know, if a youth wants to interact with authority in the community, they need to build trust. You know, you talk about all these programs for building trust, but if they're watching all these judgments and they watch the news every day, like every one of us, and they're seeing all these unfair judgments fall down on everybody except the authorities, how can we start to change ourselves? You know, it's the plan that's been over us for many and many years, and it's time to stop it so we can stop hurting ourselves and each other.
Thank you, Mr. Ashley. I appreciate your comments. Mr. Ashley brought up several different indicators, issues that touch young men of color. Kyle, can you speak to how we narrow down to what we focused on for this report? And then, Director, I want you, if you would speak to other things that we as a city are doing to kind of touch on some of those ancillary issues that are facing and plaguing young people of color or vulnerable neighborhoods just in general that the city is doing or proposing for 2018.
Certainly. So kind of the three kind of main focuses that we came together on with the City of Columbus, as well as the Department of Neighborhoods, around mentoring, workforce development, and violence prevention. Those three kind of areas were our focus, and that's kind of what got into the areas of education, health, economic, safety, and those are critical issues. And again, this is something that everyone has to have a stake in and be a part of, especially those who might not be here today or in this room or might have traditionally not been a part of these programs. We all have a role to play in lifting up our vulnerable youth. And again, talk is one thing, but action is more important. But we do have to be measured in our focus areas. So mentoring is a key issue we know that affects life outcomes and opportunities for our youth, as well as workforce development, to be able to make sure folks are connected to opportunity and have access to the resources they need. And then, of course, violence prevention, especially this year, is something where we are all seeing the experience of that violence, and in communities that are affecting predominantly boys and young men of color in these neighborhoods are disproportionately affected and are further causing stressors that are affecting life outcomes. And again, these are real lives, real people, real families, and it's something that we all have a stake in and a role to play in. And I think that's something at both the youth level is something that we need to focus on, and as well as the neighborhood level, which Director William Scott will speak to.
Thank you, Councilmember. You know, one of the things that the gentleman just mentioned, while it's not necessarily part of MBK, it is part of the larger budget plan that the mayor proposed as part of the comprehensive safety strategy. The mayor continually says we can't police our way out of violence. And so as a city, we have to look at other creative opportunities to work with our ways to work with our communities around violence and violence prevention. And so one of the things that, as part of the comprehensive neighborhood safety strategy, is funding available to look at immediate needs in communities to help address some of those issues. So for example, if we know we have a community where we are experiencing high levels of violent crime, and we know that lighting is an issue, then we have set aside funding to immediately address some of those issues for lighting. If we know that some of the issues are sidewalks that prevent people from getting from point A to point B, that will address some of those issues, I'd be happy to talk to Mr. Ashley afterwards about after the hearing, to talk to him a little bit more about the comprehensive safety strategy. The other piece I'll add to that is working, somebody mentioned the mental health challenges that a lot of our folks experience in these communities. And so as part of the comprehensive, the mayor's comprehensive safety strategy, we're also working with our partners at Columbus Public Health through the CARE Coalition, and looking at trauma-informed care and how we immediately go out into communities and help to address violent crimes, and also look at opportunities and ways to help prevent them.
Thank you, Director. Next, we have Ken Abdul. Thank you for coming this evening. I apologize.
Basically, I want to make this quick. My name is Ken Abdullah. I'm from the Right Way Mitigation. I have 25 years as a practitioner. My specialty is gangs, drugs, murder, and human trafficking. I'm back and forth from here to Baltimore. I was born and raised here, but I'm going back and forth to Baltimore. We're setting up a program. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but there's a former barber school on Carl Road. Me and my partner just bought the building. We're going to dedicate the facility for at-risk youth. I worked in 9 jurisdictions. I worked in Compton, Baltimore, Southside Chicago, Third Ward, Houston. Now I'm back here. Columbus and Baltimore combined has over 500 homicides. You see, I take this very serious because I had to notify many families in my lifetime of young brothers and sisters dying. So, again, this is my home. I was born and raised here. See, my goal is to collaborate with you guys. I don't want to be nobody's boss. Like I said, I've been a practitioner for 25 years. 2 of my own siblings were homicide victims less than a year apart. So this is not anything I'm looking for accolades. I want to help. See, I saw over the weekend there were some clergy people and community leaders got together on the south side. I'm going to get with those brothers perhaps in the next couple of days. Because this thing is serious. Because a lot of these victims, you see, it could be one of us in here. See, we might just walk around and say, oh, I made it. But anybody can be a victim. We can walk out of here, there's no damn guarantee we're going to make it home tonight. You see? But I'm not trying to put no fear in anybody. But I guess as a practitioner, I take this very serious. Because I see so many black and brown bodies on the ground. I see so many mamas crying, grandmamas crying. I got a kid right now, his mother called me. He has a GSW, a gunshot wound right above his lung that can't be surgically removed. If they remove it, he dies. So my point is, like, again, you know, it's not about me. I really need to work with you guys. I don't want nothing out the deal but to save some lives.
Yeah.
You understand my point?
Sure.
And so I met with the brother briefly, but when are we going to actually stand up and be men within our community and deal with this situation? Most of these young guys, they've never seen a daddy before in their lives, or any male figure. So it's up to those who are conscious to go and make a difference. We can sit up here and run our mouth all day, but I honestly believe I'm willing to put aside my academics to deal with the grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abdullah. You said several things that I agree with and that I hope is the spirit of MBK moving forward. One, that we have to get outside of our silos and work with each other to solve this issue. And I look forward to, my office looks forward to, certainly the Department of Neighborhoods, look forward to working with you on those efforts. So thank you. My final speaker slip that I have is for Mr. Perry Gregory. Mr. Gregory, thank you so much for coming this evening.
I guess I'll be the last one to go to ask the most important question. But first off, I want to say to Mr. Hard, Councilmember Hard, Director Scott, and the Kirwan Institute, really commend you guys for the work that you have been doing over the past years, especially with making this a targeted effort to really improve the health conditions and the mental conditions and economic conditions for African-American males. So my first question would be, is for the upcoming RFP, is how much are we anticipating in funding?
That is a great question. The total funding right now that is set aside from the city is $100,000. What we have not been specific enough to is that one grant, or is that grants that are divided up. What we would like to do with these dollars is to encourage collaboration and leverage dollars. And so we want to encourage medium, small, and even large size organizations to go after, but to go after in a way that shows that they are either working with somebody else, working with another organization, or working on this issue from a cross that serves several different of the areas from health or safety. So.
That's right. And my final question would be, what is the anticipated targeted youth that we want to serve?
So we're targeting vulnerable young men of color. And so I think that we left it broad enough, and I'm trying to speak very cautiously because I know the department is working on the RFP, but we spoke about a letter of intent that will allow you to articulate kind of how your organization and your program will support, one, the collaboration effort, but also young men of color. And so I think that we'll be able to target in there. That was.
All right, I think
Actually, Director has, Director, would you?
Yeah. As we go through developing the RFP, we'll look at, and there will probably be kind of pockets of, 0 to 10, 12 to, 16, 16 to 17 to 24 in terms of the age ranges. And so that's something we're looking at as we map out the actual RFP.
Okay.
So every organization will kind of know where they fit in that process.
Thank you. That was it.
We have one more speaker slip that I just received. Ms. Jasmine Ayers. No, take your time. Welcome, Ms. Jasmine, to council. And thank you for your support and your work of these efforts.
So first of all, I'm very encouraged by some of the familiar faces I see in this room, so this makes me excited. So my question is mainly, how are we going to integrate young men of color in the decision-making process? So a lot of times we ask them for their opinion, but they don't actually have any say in the programs that are being shaped and formed around them. And so I'm just interested to know, like, what the process will be for actually allowing them to have some say in what's going to happen. Thanks.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Director, would you want to speak to that? I know that as we are coming, so I guess I'll take a stab at it as well. We have, through this process, made sure that we've had young people at the table as we talk to service providers and folks. But as we talk about granting out dollars, as we talk about sending these dollars out, I know the director in the neighborhoods department has been very, very, very focused on making sure that young people are part of the screening of who gets the grants. But you can, Director.
We've talked about, that is a great question, so thank you. We've talked about trying to figure out how there's a way to have young people at the table as part of the review process, which will allow us we'll have to be a little creative about how and when we do that. Generally, those are done during the workday. If young people are in school or in a work program, not able to participate. So we have to be creative, and we know that, and we're willing to do that as we go through this process. The other thing that we've done through the MBK program outside of the Kirwan report and the grant process is the MBK conference and summit that we had. So we had a summit in May of this year and a conference in October of this year. And we have budgeted to do the similar programming for next year. And that is an opportunity for us to actually hear from the young men themselves about what it is they want. Because Ms. Ayers was right, a lot of times we sit around and might say what we think young folks need, but it's best to have them at the table. So we will continue to do that through our summit, the MBK conference, and figuring out how to have them at the table as part of the review team for this upcoming grant process.
Thank you, Director. Well, this brings this evening's hearing to a close, but before we leave, I wanted to stress 3 points, and I've kind of hit on them already. The first being that, when we started this conversation, we want to stress that we know that there are folks out here who have been doing the work of supporting young men of color for many years, many organizations, many churches, many individuals. And so this effort is to be a supportive effort, to be an encouraging effort for those type of works to continue. And not to step up in and take the place of. Second, that serving our vulnerable young people is something that our entire city can and should rally behind. Every organization can contribute to this. I've been asked in the past, actually over and over again, who is my brother's keeper? Is it something that's run out of the county? Is it something that's run out of the city? Is it something that's run out of a certain organization? And like I said, it's not who is MBK, it's what is my MBK. And that is our challenge to each and every one of you in the audience, but you at home, every church, this is your responsibility. This is all of our responsibility. So no one owns MBK. We all own, they're our children. They're ours. And so we're all challenged to work and support this effort. And third and finally, the MBK for the City of Columbus won't just be about this grant program, certainly will not be about the small $100,000 investment in a grants program. If that's what it is, if that's what this was about and we would be done, that would be a failure. That is not what this is. This is our city's ongoing commitment to young men of color. This is one step in that process. We will be back in next year with more things. We are working towards a collaborative effort where we all work together, where we pool resources, because at the end of the day, it will be about resources and funding from all, from all entities into a organized and directed path that we can all agree on to support young men of color. And so I don't want folks to get hung up on this step in the MBK program or to think that this is the culmination of anything. It is not. It is a comma in our work, in our city's commitment to young men of color. So again, I'd like to thank Kyle Strickland, Kirwan Institute, your whole team for the work that you've done. We would encourage folks to use the data. We put the money behind the data so that organizations can use it to go after even more funds. And we would want to be a partner to help you figure out how to use the data. If you have questions, I mean, Kirwan and others can be helpful in how we can slice up the data for you. Certainly want to thank Director Carla Williams Scott, Mayor Ginther for his support of this initiative, your entire department, of all of those community conversations. Your entire department was out there. We met with more than 100 service providers over the last two months or so. I'm very appreciative of everybody who's been engaged and everybody who has helped out. Certainly my team, Zach Davidson and Linda Capobianco, for the many days working on this, and certainly to CTV. But certainly thank you to everybody in the room. This work is thankless, and I know that you don't do it to be thanked. We're talking about saving lives. We're talking about lifting up people that our kids. We're talking about lifting up our young men. I don't see this as a black issue or a white issue. I see this as a Columbus issue, and I believe that in our city, in any other city, that in Columbus we can solve for these things, because we still believe that a kid on the south side is our responsibility, a kid on the west side is our responsibility. And so I just appreciate the work that you do. I know it's thankless. I know that it is tough, especially in the environment that we're in, the homicide rates that we're seeing right now. We talk about data. If you look at the data of those homicide rates, young men of color are disproportionately affected by those homicides. And so that's why our work is so important. And so just want to encourage folks to stay in it, stay at it. Your city has your back in the work. Like Kyle said, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to solve these issues overnight, but we're going to keep at it. Thank you, and have a blessed holiday.